She came home from the grocery store, both hands full, keys in her mouth, and there they were, on the counter, beside the fruit bowl, 9 pages of legal paper that said, in plain language, that her husband of 14 years was done with her. No phone call, no conversation, no warning, just papers, and a lemon rolling across the floor. She was 40 years old. She had given up her career for this man, her independence, 8 years of professional identity, gone, because he asked her to be available, because he said he needed her present. What she didn't know yet, what she was about to discover, was that while she was being the perfect available wife, her billionaire husband had been building something else entirely. A fraud, a shell company, $12.4 million hidden in the structure of a $400 million acquisition. And he thought she would never find it. He thought she would take his settlement offer, $240,000 and the contents of a kitchen, and disappear quietly. He forgot one thing. She used to be a corporate attorney, and she was pregnant. This is the story of one night, one gala, one woman who walked into a room of 300 people and said everything that needed to be said in front of every board member, every shareholder, every person who had ever underestimated her. By morning, everything had changed, not because she wanted revenge, because she remembered who she was. The lesson this story carries: when someone tries to erase you, the most powerful thing you can do is remember your own name. If this story made you feel something, if any part of it sounded like something you already know, please stay until the end, and if it meant something to you, share it with one woman in your life who needs to hear it today. Hit that like button if you believe that women who have been underestimated are the most dangerous people in the room. Leave a comment and tell me, what part of Claire's story stayed with you? And if you're new here, subscribe and turn on the bell. Because every story on this channel is for women who are somewhere in the middle of their own becoming. You found this one for a reason. Now let's begin.
The papers were on the kitchen counter, not in an envelope, not in a folder, just there, fanned out beside the fruit bowl like someone had set down the mail. Claire Whitmore saw them the moment she came in from the grocery store, both hands full of canvas bags, keys still between her teeth. She stopped in the doorway. She stood very still. She didn't think anything terrible yet. Not right away. Her brain did that thing where it slides off something it doesn't want to process, like a foot testing ice, not sure it will hold. She put the bags down slowly on the floor. She took the keys out of her mouth. She walked to the counter. She picked up the first sheet. The words didn't make sense immediately. Legal language worked that way sometimes. You read a sentence and your eyes moved across it, but the meaning didn't land. She remembered that feeling from her years as an attorney, reading contracts at midnight. The way your brain could process words without absorbing them. She read the sentence again. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Petitioner, Daniel James Whitmore. Respondent, Claire Ann Whitmore. She set the page down. She picked it up again. She read it a third time. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street below. The refrigerator hummed behind her. One of the canvas bags on the floor tipped sideways, and a lemon rolled out, slow and deliberate, and bumped against the cabinet with a small, hollow sound. Claire stood there. Her eyes drifted to the fruit bowl. There was a banana in it that had gone soft and brown on one end. She'd been meaning to make banana bread for 2 weeks. There was a ceramic chicken beside the bowl that she'd bought at a craft fair in Vermont 4 years ago. She and Daniel had gone for their 10th anniversary. She'd thought the chicken was charming. He'd thought it was ugly, but hadn't said so until a month later, when he mentioned it in passing and then never mentioned it again. She'd kept it anyway. She looked at the chicken. She looked at the papers. Petitioner, Daniel James Whitmore. Her husband of 14 years, had left divorce papers on the kitchen counter while she was at the grocery store buying parsley and a lemon. The sound she made surprised her. Small and involuntary, just a short exhale, like someone had pressed one finger firmly against her sternum. Not a sob, not a gasp. Just that small, unwilling sound that escapes before you can decide whether to allow it. She sat down on the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinet, the lemon near her foot. The canvas bags tipped and scattered around her. She sat there for a long time. The room went quiet, the way rooms do when something has shifted, and the air itself hasn't caught up yet. Daniel wasn't home. Of course he wasn't home. She tried to remember the last time he'd been home before 8 o'clock on a weeknight. She counted back through the weeks. She couldn't land on a specific evening. She got up eventually. She put the groceries away. The milk, the bread, the parsley she'd never used now, the lemon she'd rolled back across the floor and retrieved. She put things in their places in the refrigerator and in the cabinets, and she moved through the kitchen doing this ordinary, mechanical thing while those papers sat on the counter watching her. When the bags were empty and folded, she picked up the papers. She sat at the kitchen table and read all 9 pages. Daniel's attorney was named Clifford Gray of Gray and Parrish Associates. She'd met him 3 years ago at a holiday party. He'd shaken her hand firmly and asked what she did. She'd said she used to be an attorney. Actually, he'd made a sound like that was mildly interesting and then looked over her shoulder at someone else. The papers stated irreconcilable differences. They stated a proposed division of assets. They stated that Daniel was not seeking spousal support from Claire. They stated that Daniel was willing to allow Claire to retain the contents of their shared home in exchange for a clean and uncontested settlement. The contents of their shared home: the ceramic chicken, the parsley, the fruit bowl. Claire set the papers down. She pressed both palms flat on the table, felt the grain of the wood under her hands, solid, real. He planned this, she thought. This wasn't today. This was weeks ago at least, months maybe, and she hadn't known. That was the part that arrived like something dropped from a great height. Not the papers, not the divorce, the fact that she hadn't known, that she had been living in this apartment, cooking in this kitchen, sleeping in that bed, for months potentially, while her husband was quietly and methodically dismantling 14 years, and she had not known. She took her phone off the charger. She scrolled to Daniel's name. Her thumb hovered. She didn't call. Instead, she went to the bathroom and ran cold water in the sink and splashed her face twice. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked exactly like herself. Same brown hair with a few strands of gray at the temples. Same gray eyes. Same 40-year-old face. That had finally, somewhere around 37, settled into something that looked right to her. Something she recognized. She looked exactly the same. How was that possible? She went and sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't know how much time passed. The room went from bright afternoon to gold to the gray of early evening. And then, almost like an afterthought, almost the way you suddenly remember something you've been meaning to do for days, she thought, my period is late. She counted back. She counted back again. 12 days. She was 12 days late. She and Daniel had been at their lake house at the end of January. She remembered the weekend clearly. One of those quiet, disconnected trips that had felt, at the time, like maybe things between them were better than they seemed. Like maybe the distance was just the winter. They'd cooked dinner together. He'd been present in a way he hadn't been in months. She'd thought it was a turning point. She'd thought they were still something. 12 days late. She stared at the wall. Not now, she thought. Not possibly now. But she was 40 years old, and her body had been a reliable clock since she was 17. She sat on the edge of the bed in the darkening room and did not move for a long time. She didn't sleep that night. Daniel came home at 10:45. She heard his key in the lock, his briefcase set down, the particular sound of his shoes on the kitchen floor. She knew every sound this apartment made, every habit of his movement through it. 14 years of accumulated knowing. She was in the living room, lights on, hands folded in her lap. He came around the corner and stopped when he saw her. His face moved through something she couldn't immediately name. Not guilt, exactly. More like the expression of a man who calculated that an event would happen at a certain time and is mildly surprised to find it happening slightly earlier. "Claire," he said. "You left them on the counter," she said. Her voice came out steady. That surprised her. "I was going to call," he said. "I wanted to discuss this with you properly." "You wanted to discuss it with me," she said. "Yes." "By leaving legal documents on the counter." He ran a hand through his hair. That gesture. Index finger first, then the palm. She could have drawn it from memory with her eyes closed. She'd watched it in arguments and in meetings and on telephone calls for 14 years. "I know this is a shock," he said. "I know this is a shock." Like she'd been startled by an unexpected house guest. Like the weather had turned. "Is there someone else?" she asked. The pause lasted half a second too long. "That's not what this is about," he said. She looked at him. This man she had loved. This man she had arranged her entire existence around. Her career, her friendships, her city, her schedule, her identity. This man who was standing in their living room telling her that the dissolution of their marriage was not about what she already knew it was about. "Okay," she said, quietly. She stood up, walked past him, went into the bedroom, closed the door behind her. She heard him standing on the other side of it for a moment. Then she heard him walk away toward his office. She sat on her side of the bed, always her side, the right side. For 14 years it had been her side. She put her hand over her mouth. She breathed. "I know this is a shock." "Yes, Daniel. Yes, it is." She didn't cry that first night. She would wonder about that later. There would be crying, plenty of it, arriving in waves she couldn't always predict. But that first night, she lay in the dark, and her mind moved through the last 14 years, the way you walk through a house after a long absence, turning on lights, looking carefully at what was there. She and Daniel had met at a firm holiday party. She was 26, he was 30. She'd been a third-year associate, burning herself out on 18-hour days, standing at the bar, waiting for her drink. When he leaned over and said, without preamble, "You look like the most interesting person in this room," she'd laughed. Nobody had ever said anything like that to her before. 3 months later, she was in love the way you are when you're young enough to believe love is a natural law, structural, inevitable, like gravity. She thought about the years that followed, the small apartment on Fletcher Street where they'd lived for 2 years before Daniel's company took off, the way he brought coffee to her desk when she was working late, the way he said she was brilliant. "You are the most brilliant person I know, Claire." So many times in those early years that she'd come to believe it was simply a feature of her that he noticed. The way you'd note that someone had blue eyes or was good at cooking. She thought about the day he asked her to stop working. Whitmore Digital had just gone public. He was managing the transition from startup to publicly traded company, and the chaos was real. Press, travel, investor calls at all hours. He sat across from her at the kitchen table one evening and he said, "I need you to be available. I need you present. Can you do that for me?" He'd said, "For me?" She'd said yes. She gave her notice 2 weeks later. She told herself it was temporary. 1 year, maybe 2. And then the years accumulated, and her bar certification lapsed, and the conversations about going back got shorter and further apart until they simply stopped happening. She was good at being Daniel's wife. She managed their social calendar and their properties and the charitable foundation they'd started together. She was good at all of it. She had told herself this was enough. Lying in the dark now, she thought clearly and without drama. "I convinced myself I chose this." The thought landed without emotion, just quiet certainty. "I convinced myself I chose this." And I didn't choose it. It was arranged for me, slowly and carefully, until I couldn't see the arrangement anymore. In the morning, Daniel was already gone. There was a text from Clifford Gray at 7:15, expressing his hope that she had retained, or would shortly retain, independent legal counsel and wishing her well. It wished her well. She stared at that for a long time. She showered, made coffee, did all of it on autopilot while her mind was somewhere else entirely. Then she went to Daniel's home office. She hadn't been in this room in over a year. He'd become particular about it somewhere along the way. Locked when he traveled. A filing system she wasn't to touch. She had accepted this with the same quiet compliance she'd applied to most things for the last several years. God, I was so trusting, she thought. She tried the little silver key from the kitchen miscellaneous drawer. The one she'd never been certain about. The lock turned. She stood in the doorway. She wasn't searching for anything specific. She just stood there, looking, the way you look at a familiar room when something feels different and you're trying to identify what's changed. Clear desk, locked filing cabinet, bookshelf with business titles and biographies. The framed annual report from Whitmore Digital's first year as a public company. She'd given him that on their anniversary. Had it framed and mounted herself. She turned to go. And then she saw his laptop. On the credenza behind the desk. He never left his laptop. She told herself not to open it. She opened it. Password protected. She couldn't get in. She was about to close it when she noticed the calendar application was visible in the notification panel on the lock screen. Dinner V, Bellamont, 8 p.m. V call, 9 a.m. V hotel, checking out. She stared at the screen. V. She scrolled back through the notifications. 3 months of them. 3 months of appointments with V scattered through his calendar like evidence of a parallel life. She said the letter out loud, softly, standing in his office in her robe, saying the initial of someone she didn't know yet, but already understood completely. She closed the laptop and placed it back exactly as she'd found it. She walked to the kitchen and stood at the counter. Then she went to the bathroom and threw up. She sat in the parking garage for 40 minutes, engine off, both hands resting in her lap. The concrete pillar in front of her. The fluorescent lights casting that institutional pale yellow over everything. She'd gotten dressed with the intention of going somewhere, to her mother's, or to Patrice's salon, anywhere that wasn't this apartment. But when she reached the car, she couldn't move. 3 months of meetings with V, she thought, and the papers were filed 4 days ago. He had been planning this while she was here, while she was shopping for groceries and managing the foundation and attending his company events and being the good, available wife he'd asked her to be. He'd been planning this for months while she stood in this kitchen. Her phone buzzed. Patrice. The message said, "Girl, are you alive? You texted me at 2 in the morning saying I need to tell you something, and then nothing. I have been calling since 7. Claire looked at that message. Right. She had done that. Picked up her phone in the middle of the night and typed those words and then put the phone back down and stared at the ceiling. She called. "I'm fine," she said, when Patrice picked up. "You are absolutely not fine," Patrice said immediately. "What happened? Claire, tell me what happened." "Daniel filed for divorce," she said. Silence. Then Patrice said, "When?" 4 days ago, apparently. He left the papers on the counter. The silence changed. It became fuller, denser. "He left them on the counter," Patrice repeated. "Yes." "Like a bill." "Like a grocery receipt, really. Just there beside the fruit bowl." "Claire. And I think there's someone else. I found his calendar. There's a V in there, a lot of V's going back 3 months, and..." Stop. Patrice's voice went quiet and precise. Listen to me carefully. Where are you right now? The parking garage. Are you driving? No, I'm just sitting here. Okay. A pause. Honey, I have been biting my tongue for 2 years. Claire closed her eyes. What do you mean? She said, though something in her stomach already knew. I mean that something has been wrong for a long time. And I didn't say it because I thought it would work itself out, because you seemed okay, because every time I almost said something, you told me everything was fine. Another pause. You weren't fine, were you? Patrice said. Claire opened her eyes. The parking garage, the pillar, the humming fluorescent light. No, she said. I wasn't fine, okay? Patrice's voice shifted, purposeful now, steady. Okay, you're going to come here, right now. I'm clearing my 10 o'clock. You're going to sit in my chair and we're going to figure out what comes next. Together. Patrice. Claire, come here. She came. Patrice's salon smelled like shea butter and warm hair and the lavender oil diffuser she ran on the shelf near the front window. Claire had been coming here for 8 years. She knew the creak in the floorboard near the second chair, the way afternoon light came through the east window at 2 o'clock. The names of all three of the plants Patrice kept alive through what she called aggressive neglect. Today the salon felt like the safest room in the city. She sat in the chair. Patrice stood behind her, not yet touching her hair, just standing there and looking at her reflection in the mirror. Start from the beginning, Patrice said. All of it. So Claire told her, the papers on the counter, the calendar, the V, sitting in the parking garage, unable to move, the quiet conversation in the living room. Is there someone else? And the half-second pause before that's not what this is about. Patrice listened, without interrupting. This was unusual for Patrice. When Claire finished, Patrice picked up a wide-toothed comb and began working it gently through Claire's hair. Just something to do with her hands. She'd done this since their sophomore year of college. Some things didn't change. How long do you think it's been going on? Patrice asked. I don't know. The calendar goes back 3 months, but he's careful. He wouldn't start a paper trail at the beginning of something. Do you know someone named Vanessa at his company? Patrice said. The question landed. Claire looked at Patrice in the mirror. Why Vanessa? She said. Because Daniel's general counsel is named Vanessa Trent, and she started 18 months ago, and every time I've seen the two of you at events, Daniel is very attentive to knowing where she is in the room. Patrice said it matter-of-factly. I noticed it at the Founders Gala last April. I told myself I was imagining it. You didn't say anything to me. You told me your marriage was fine. Claire stopped. She thought about the last 18 months, the way she'd covered, the excuses she'd made. He's just stressed about the new product cycle. He's distracted, that's all. He's always been reserved. The full-time, invisible labor of interpreting Daniel's behavior in the most generous possible light. I was being managed, she thought, the whole time. Every reassurance I made, every excuse I constructed, was exactly what he needed me to do. Vanessa Trent, Claire said quietly. Georgetown J.D., Patrice said. 29 years old. 29. Claire was 40. She looked at herself in the mirror, the brown hair with the gray strands she'd stopped coloring because Daniel said he liked them, the 40-year-old face, the woman who used to be a corporate attorney and was now something she couldn't immediately name. What was she now, exactly? The thing that keeps coming back to me, Claire said slowly, is that I left my career for him. He asked, and I said yes. And I thought he asked because I mattered, because he needed me specifically, because my presence in his life was important to him. She paused. He asked because it was convenient, she said. Having a wife with no independent income, no professional network, no career of her own, that's not love. That's leverage. Patrice said nothing. She kept working the comb through, steady and patient. I wasn't a partner to him, Claire said. I was infrastructure. A very expensive, well-maintained piece of household infrastructure. She watched her own face say these things in the mirror. He never loved me, she thought. He loved what having me represented. It arrived not as a question, but as a statement, flat and certain, and somehow that certainty was more devastating than any uncertainty had been. She went to a pharmacy on the way home. She stood in the aisle. She picked up 2 different brands and then added a third because her hands needed to be completely sure. Home, bathroom, the edge of the tub. She sat and waited 3 minutes. All 3 tests. Positive. She sat on the edge of the tub for a long time without moving. I cannot do this, she thought. Then she thought, yes, you can. Friend, I cannot do this right now. Then you don't have to decide everything right now. She picked up her phone and called her doctor's office. The receptionist said Dr. Price had an opening Monday at 9. Claire said that was fine and sat there afterward with the phone in her hand. Daniel's baby. Her baby. She thought about the lake house in January, the weekend that had felt like a turning point. They'd made dinner together. He'd been present in a way he hadn't been in months. She'd received that presence like a gift because she'd been so hungry for it. He'd already been planning the exit by then, in his mind at least, already thinking through the structure of leaving. And she had been making soup with him in the kitchen thinking maybe we're going to be okay. She put the tests in the cabinet under the sink. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table. And then her phone rang with an unknown number. Something made her answer. Claire Whitmore? Said a man's voice. Yes, she said. This is Marcus Webb. She knew who Marcus Webb was, Daniel's co-founder, COO of Whitmore Digital. She'd had dinner with him dozens of times. Marcus, she said carefully, I heard about the filing, he said, and I need to be careful how I say what I'm about to say. He paused. I think you should retain a very good attorney, Claire, and I think that attorney should ask for thorough financial disclosure. That's standard in divorce proceedings, she said slowly. Yes. Another pause. The weight in his voice was measurable. Make sure it's thorough. Marcus? She kept her voice level. Is there something you want to tell me? The silence stretched out. I can't tell you anything, he said. I need to be clear about that. I cannot tell you anything. But you're calling to suggest my attorney should look closely at the finances. I'm calling because you are a good person who deserves to know that things are not what they appear to be. He paused. Look at the numbers, that's all I can say. Look at the numbers. The line went quiet. She sat at the table for a long time. She had been a corporate attorney. She knew exactly what that phone call meant. She got out her laptop, and she called Gordon Hale. Gordon Hale's office was exactly as she remembered it. Dark wood paneling, a wall of books with cracked spines that had actually been read, a leather chair on the client's side that had held decades of difficult conversations. He stood when she walked in and shook her hand with both of his the way he always had. Claire, he said, it is very good to see you and very unfortunate about the circumstances. Both things at once, she agreed. She sat down. She'd known Gordon Hale for 16 years. He was her mentor, before Daniel, before the transition from attorney to wife. He'd sent her a handwritten note when she passed the bar, another when she left the firm. She'd always suspected he didn't approve of her leaving. He never said so. Tell me what we're looking at, he said. She laid it out, the papers, the proposed settlement, the asset division that looked reasonable on the surface, but excluded Whitmore Digital entirely. No stock, no company valuations. The company treated as completely separate from the marriage. He's invoking a prenuptial agreement, she said. Do you have a copy? I'm his wife, not his client. I have what's in the filing, nothing else. Gordon nodded slowly. And the settlement proposes you receive the apartment contents, your vehicle, and a lump sum. $240,000, she said. Gordon looked at her over his glasses for a moment. His company is valued at $3.2 billion, she said. I know what his company is worth. That settlement is designed to make me disappear, she said. Yes, Gordon said. It is. She told him about Marcus's phone call. Not with specifics, because there were none, just the weight of that word. Thorough. Gordon was quiet. What was your specialty? He asked finally. Before. Corporate contracts. Some M&A work. So you understand how to read financial structures. I understand how they work, yes. He leaned forward slightly. Whitmore Digital has made 3 acquisitions in 4 years. The last one, Meridian Systems, closed 18 months ago. $400 million valuation. It closed very quietly for its size. He paused. When a deal like that closes quietly, it's either because everything was done correctly or because someone with considerable skill made sure it didn't look like it wasn't. She absorbed that. You think there's something irregular about the Meridian acquisition, she said. I think, Gordon said carefully, that when a man's long-standing business partner calls his soon-to-be ex-wife and tells her to look at the numbers, a good attorney does exactly that. You'll request full financial disclosure. Every page, every filing, every transfer, every subsidiary. He paused. And I want to be direct with you about one more thing. Even without any irregularities, the prenuptial agreement isn't necessarily the final word. You left a career for this marriage. Courts recognize spousal contribution to a partner's professional success. There are arguments. But if there are irregularities, she said, then the entire conversation changes. She nodded. She told him about the pregnancy. He was quiet for a moment. Are you pregnant, Claire? I believe so. I have an appointment Monday. He was careful with the next words. A pregnancy changes the legal landscape significantly. Parental rights, child support, custody arrangements, these exist regardless of the divorce timeline. I know, she said. I'm still in the part where I feel like I might be hallucinating all of this. He almost smiled. That part does pass. When? It passes when the anger arrives. And in my experience, the anger is where clients do their best thinking. She looked at him. She wasn't angry yet, not fully, but something was building in her chest. Cold and precise and crystalline, different from the raw, flooding grief of the night before. Wait, she told herself. Wait for the appointment. Wait for the numbers. Wait. She was good at waiting. Daniel had inadvertently taught her that. 14 years of adjusting her pace to his had made her patient in ways she was only beginning to understand could be useful. She shook Gordon's hand at the door. One more thing, he said. The settlement offer. Have you responded? No. Don't? Not yet. Not one word. She nodded. She walked out into the March air. The city moved around her. Traffic, a group of office workers on a lunch break, a woman pushing a stroller, all of it normal, ordinary, completely unchanged by the fact that her life had been rearranged in the space of 48 hours. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed. Starting from here, she thought, not starting over, starting from here, there is a difference. Clifford Gray called that evening. Pleasant, professional, the warmth of a man delivering a veiled threat in a cashmere coat. Ms. Whitmore, he said. She noted the Ms. already. I want to ensure you've received the documentation and are being well advised. I've retained Gordon Hale, she said. A brief pause. I see. He cleared his throat. Well, that's entirely your right. I want to reiterate that Mr. Whitmore is very interested in a resolution that is fair and efficient. He'd prefer to avoid extended litigation. How interesting, Claire said. So would I. Then you'll understand that the proposed settlement is inadequate, she said, a longer pause. Ms. Whitmore, Mr. Gray, she said, I'm going to suggest we wait for this conversation until both attorneys are present. Things go better that way. She ended the call. Then she called Patrice. I'm okay, she said, when Patrice answered. And then she cried so hard she had to lower herself to the kitchen floor. Not quietly, not gracefully, the raw, gasping kind of crying that leaves you wrung out and somehow cleaner afterward. She sat on the tile with her back against the cabinet, and she cried the way she hadn't cried in years while Patrice stayed on the line and said nothing at all. Just breathed, just stayed. When it was over, Patrice said, There, okay, there you go. I'm sorry, Claire said. Don't you dare apologize for that, Patrice said. That's been waiting in there too long. I haven't cried like that in... She tried to remember. Years. I know. Why did I stop? The question slipped out before she decided to ask it. Patrice was quiet. Because he made you feel like your feelings were inconvenient, Patrice said. I watched him do it for 2 years at minimum. Every time you were scared or sad or needed something, he had this particular way of making you feel like you were being dramatic, like you were too much. Claire sat on the floor. You're overreacting, Claire. You're catastrophizing. You're being sensitive today. How many times had she heard those words and then felt ashamed of her own feelings inside her own life? I started apologizing for having emotions, she thought. I actually apologized for having them. That's done, she said. Good, Patrice said. I'm done apologizing for feeling things. Good. I was good to him, Patrice. The anger arrived then, sudden and cold and clean. I was genuinely good to him. I had a career. I was building something real. And I gave it all up because he said he needed me, and I believed him. Her hands were shaking. She noticed them shaking. I deserved better than this. Yes, Patrice said. You did. I deserved so much better than this. Yes, you did, she breathed. I'm pregnant, she said, silence. Then Patrice said, in the quietest voice Claire had ever heard from her, Oh, honey, I know. Oh, honey, I know. She didn't sleep that night either. She lay in bed until 1 a.m, and then she gave up on sleep entirely. She got up, made chamomile tea, sat at the dining table with her laptop open. She searched. How long does a divorce typically take? She searched. Can a prenuptial agreement be challenged? She searched. Spousal contribution to company valuation during marriage. She searched. What is securities fraud in an acquisition? She fell asleep at 4:15 with her phone on her chest and the laptop still open beside her. When she woke at 7, she had 12 search tabs open and her neck hurt. And there was a text from Beverly, her mother, that said simply, Call me when you can, sweetheart. Her mother always knew. Claire had no idea how. She didn't call yet. Not until she was ready. When she called Beverly, she would have to say everything out loud in the real order, and she needed a few more hours before she could do that. The doctor's appointment was Monday. She spent the weekend reading. Not the financial documents, not yet. Those would come through Gordon in the disclosure request. Instead, she read about the Meridian acquisition. It was a matter of public record since Whitmore Digital was a publicly traded company. $400 million, a tech infrastructure company based in Seattle. The deal had closed in October, 18 months ago. The coverage at the time was minimal for a transaction its size. A brief mention in 2 industry publications and 1 paragraph in a business section. She thought about what Gordon had said. When a deal like that closes quietly. She read through the public filings until 2 a.m, and then she closed the laptop. She reorganized the linen closet at 2:15. She didn't plan to. She was walking past it on her way to get a glass of water, and the door was slightly ajar, and she opened it, and something in her hands needed to move. So she took everything out, every towel, every pillowcase, every extra blanket. She folded each one precisely. She arranged them by size and then by color. She rebuilt the shelf from the bottom up. Her hands moved steadily while her mind turned over everything she'd read. There was something in the Meridian acquisition. She could feel it the way she used to feel problems and contracts. A slight resistance, like a nail catching on fabric. She couldn't name it yet, but it was there. She put the last folded towel in its place and stood in the hallway holding an empty laundry basket. 3 in the morning, navy silence, just the hum of the building around her. I'm not crazy, she thought. I know what I'm feeling, and something is buried in those numbers. She went back to bed. She didn't sleep. Monday morning, Dr. Sandra Price's office. The waiting room had pale yellow walls and a fish tank in the corner with 4 orange fish that moved in slow, unhurried circles. Claire sat and counted the fish several times. She filled out the intake form, checked yes under currently pregnant, checked no under partner or spouse present. She handed the clipboard back to the receptionist and sat with her hands in her lap and counted the fish again. Dr. Price was exactly the kind of doctor Claire had always needed. Direct without being cold, precise without being clinical. She confirmed the pregnancy with an ultrasound. She estimated 7 weeks, which placed conception at the lake house exactly. She did the initial examination. She answered questions. She handed Claire a folder of information. Any questions? Dr. Price asked. How does everything look? Claire said. Healthy, completely healthy. Monitoring will increase as we go, given your age. But today there's nothing concerning. Claire looked at the folder. There was a photograph inside of an embryo at 7 weeks. A small, perfect nautilus curl. She looked at it for a moment. I'm getting divorced, she said. Dr. Price nodded. Not with surprise. With the particular steadiness of a woman who had heard many versions of many complicated things in this room. I'm 7 weeks pregnant and getting divorced, and my husband doesn't know about the pregnancy because he filed the papers before I knew, Claire said. That's a significant amount to carry simultaneously, Dr. Price said. Yes. Claire looked at the photograph again. I want to keep the baby. She hadn't said it out loud before that moment. She heard herself say it. Okay, Dr. Price said, simply and without judgment. The circumstances are complicated. Most circumstances are. I'm 40 years old and getting divorced, and the baby's father doesn't know I'm pregnant. Those are facts, Dr. Price said. They don't determine outcome. They're only the facts. Claire looked at her. I feel like I should write that down, Claire said. It holds up, Dr. Price said. She drove from the doctor's office to her mother's house. 40 minutes out of the city, the highway narrowing into smaller roads. The familiar progression of exits she'd known her whole life. The oak tree at the corner that had been there before she was born. Her mother's house at the end of the street with the porch light on even in the daytime, because Beverly Marsh always left it on for her daughter. The door opened before she knocked. Her mother looked at her face for 1 second and said, Come inside. They sat at the kitchen table. Beverly put the kettle on without asking. The room smelled like the apple cake cooling on the counter. She always baked when she sensed that something was coming. He filed for divorce, Claire said. And there's someone else. Beverly set her teacup down with great care. And I'm pregnant, Claire said. The kitchen was very quiet. Beverly looked at her daughter with the kind of steadiness that contains everything and expresses only love. The particular look of a mother who has decided that her job in this moment is simply to be solid. 7 weeks, Claire said. Beverly reached across the table and took both of Claire's hands. She held them. She didn't speak for a while. When she finally did, she said, "Tell me what you need." Claire had been prepared for questions, for concern, for the practical cascade of worry that most people would reach for. What are you going to do? Does he know? Have you thought about? Her mother asked what she needed. That was the question that broke her open. It was quieter than the crying she'd done on the kitchen floor. Slower, tears moving down her face warm and steady, while her mother held her hands and the tea cooled and the light through the window moved from pale to gold. "I'm scared," Claire said when she could speak. "And I'm so angry. And I don't know yet exactly what I'm building toward, but I know I'm not going to go quietly. I know that much." "No," Beverly said. "You're not. Something is wrong with his financials. I can feel it. And I used to be good at this. I used to be very good at reading this kind of thing." "You still are," Beverly said simply. "I haven't practiced in 8 years." "You've been out of a building," Beverly said. "You haven't been out of your mind. Everything you know is still in there." Claire looked at her. "Your father used to say that about you," Beverly said softly. "He said Claire's the kind of person who doesn't forget what she knows. He said it at your law school graduation." She paused. "He would be so proud of you right now. Sitting here, not running." Claire thought about her father. 12 years gone. She missed him with a specific sharpness today. "I'm not running," she agreed. "No," Beverly said. "You're not?" The first tranche of financial disclosure documents arrived from Clifford Gray's office on Thursday afternoon. Gordon had requested them immediately. Company filings, property records, investment accounts, the standard first layer of a divorce financial proceeding. Claire sat at the dining table with a pot of coffee and every document spread in front of her. It was 7 in the evening when she started. She'd eaten half a sandwich. She didn't notice when it went cold. The old rhythm came back to her slowly at first and then faster, reading financial documents the way some people read music, listening for the notes that were wrong, the pauses that shouldn't be there, the phrases that technically said one thing and functionally meant another. At 11 o'clock, she found it. It wasn't obvious. It was precisely the kind of thing designed not to be obvious. A transfer from Whitmore Holdings, LLC, to a third-party company called Cascadia Infrastructure Group, repeated at irregular intervals across 18 months, each transfer between $1.8 and $3.2 million. She sat back. Cascadia Infrastructure Group. She'd never heard of it. She searched. Nothing public, no website, no news, no SEC filings she could access. A Delaware registration filed 18 months ago, right around the time of the Meridian acquisition. She opened the Meridian acquisition documents. Public record. She read them line by line. She found it at 12:41 in the morning. A payment structure clause routed through a holding company. She traced the structure. The holding company fed into Cascadia Infrastructure Group. She sat very still for a long time. This was not a mistake. This was architecture, a shell company, a routed payment, a benefit flowing to someone who should not have received it, structured specifically to avoid appearing on regulatory filings, a kickback. She stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the city, the lights moving below, the ordinary ongoing city. "Look at the numbers," Marcus had said. Marcus Webb, who built this company alongside Daniel, who had been sitting on something he couldn't say and had chosen her as the person to send the signal to. He knew, she thought. He knew, and he waited for someone to open the door. She went back to the table. She traced the structure again, from the beginning, to be certain. Then she picked up her phone. She typed a text to Gordon that said, "I need to speak with you first thing tomorrow morning. I found something." She put the phone down. She stood in the kitchen and thought about Daniel's face, the way he ran his hand through his hair when he was managing a situation. Index finger first, then the palm, the gesture of a man who believed he was always managing things successfully. He had been building this for a long time, she thought. Not just the divorce, the shell company, the acquisition structure, the exit strategy from the marriage. All of it built with the same methodical care, all of it designed to be untouchable. She thought about the settlement offer, $240,000 and the contents of a kitchen. He had almost succeeded. She almost laughed, and the laugh almost became something else. But she held it. No, she thought. You are not going to rush me. You are not going to make me disappear for $240,000 and a ceramic chicken. I am going to be patient. I'm going to be thorough. And you are going to understand that getting rid of me is not going to be simple. She went back to the documents. She read until 3 a.m. Gordon's office, 8 a.m. She laid out everything she'd found. The Cascadia transfers, the Meridian clause, the holding company structure, the 18-month pattern. Gordon was quiet for a long time after she finished. You found all of this last night, he said, between 7 and 12:41, in the first tranche of disclosure documents. Yes. He looked at her notes. He looked at her. Claire, he said, this is excellent work. I know what I'm looking at, she said. I need someone to confirm it. I have a forensic accountant I trust completely, he said, already reaching for his pen. Her name is Rita Caldwell. She's the best I've worked with. He paused. And I need you to understand what this means for the divorce proceeding. It potentially voids the prenuptial agreement, she said, if the financial structure was built during the marriage using marital assets. Potentially voids it entirely. And there may be separate legal exposure for Daniel that has nothing to do with the divorce. Securities fraud, she said. If the acquisition was structured to create an undisclosed benefit to an insider without regulatory disclosure, he paused. Yes, significant exposure. She sat with that. Do you want this? She asked herself. You're not just ending a marriage, you're potentially ending him. She thought about the papers on the counter beside the fruit bowl. She thought about $240,000 and a lemon rolling across the floor. She thought about V and his calendar, 3 months of scheduled meetings with someone she'd never met, who was 29 years old. She thought about a small, perfect curl of a thing, 7 weeks along, that she was going to raise, that was going to need her whole and standing and on her own ground. Yes, she said. Let's do this right. Gordon nodded. One more thing, she said. I haven't told Daniel about the pregnancy. I've been thinking about that, he said. From a legal standpoint, he has a right to know. And it's considerably better coming directly from you than through the proceeding. I understand, she said. I want to wait until the forensic review has started. I want to understand the shape of this before I change the dynamic. He considered that. That's a defensible position strategically, but a week at most. Don't wait longer than a week. A week, she agreed. She shook his hand at the door. She stood on the sidewalk in the March air. Something had shifted. The woman who'd sat on the kitchen floor, surrounded by fallen grocery bags, was not this woman. This woman had spent a night reading financial structures and found what the most expensive attorneys in the city had tried to bury. I am not starting over, she thought. I am starting from here. There is a real difference between those two things. Rita Caldwell arrived at Gordon's office on Thursday. She was 53 years old, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the particular quality of stillness that the very best financial investigators develop, the stillness of someone who has learned that if you sit with numbers long enough, they always start to talk. She went through Claire's findings, asked precise questions, requested additional documentation, took notes in a small notebook with a mechanical pencil. At the end of the meeting, she set a single sheet of paper on the table. "This is a well-designed concealment structure," she said. "Whoever built it knew what they were doing, but it has the same fundamental weakness every structure like this has." She paused. "It leaves a trail." She slid the sheet forward. Claire looked at it. The director of Cascadia Infrastructure Group's parent holding company was listed as D.J. Whitmore. D.J. Whitmore, Daniel James. She looked at that name on the page. She thought about every version of him she'd known. The young man at the bar who said she was the most interesting person in the room. The man who brought her coffee at her desk. The man who asked her to stop working. The man who left papers on the counter and said, "I know this is a shock." He had been building this particular thing for a long time. The fraud, the exit, the shell company, the structure designed so that by the time anyone looked closely, he would be safely gone from the marriage with his assets intact. All of it. The precision of it made her cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. So the Meridian acquisition payments, she said, they went to a company controlled by Daniel. Approximately $12.4 million over 18 months, Rita said. None of it disclosed on any regulatory filing. The room was very quiet. "That's securities fraud," Claire said. "That determination belongs to the SEC," Gordon said. "Our job is to document it and ensure full disclosure in the divorce proceeding." "Yes," Claire said. "Yes." That evening she went home and stood in the bathroom for a long time. The navy dress was hanging on the back of the door. She'd taken it out of the closet earlier to see if it still fit properly. She'd bought it 2 years ago for a company event. Daniel had looked at it and said it made her look too serious. She looked at herself in it now. "He always said you look too serious in this dress," she told her reflection. Her reflection looked back at her steadily. Good, she thought. She took the dress off and hung it carefully back on the door. Then she went to the kitchen and she stood at the counter and she felt the weight of everything at once. The pregnancy, 14 years, the fraud, the settlement offer, the ceramic chicken, Vanessa Trent, who was 29, the shell company with Daniel's initials, all of it pressing down at the same time. She went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub. She sat there and let herself feel all of it, without trying to manage any of it. The grief. The real grief. Not for the man, she was discovering, not even for the marriage as she'd believed it to be. The grief was for the story she had told herself about who they were together, about what it meant that she'd stayed, about the love she'd believed was there. That story was over. And something about letting it be over, was the most painful thing she had done in years. She sat on the edge of the tub, and she let herself mourn it. Not for long, 20 minutes, maybe. The kind of specific, final crying that functions as a burial. You cry it completely, and then you get up, and you understand that something has been released. She got up. She washed her face. She went back to the kitchen. She made herself a real dinner for the first time in a week. Pasta with olive oil and garlic and the parsley that she hadn't thrown away after all. She ate at the kitchen table with the ceramic chicken watching from the counter. She was going to keep the chicken, she had decided. Patrice came over Friday evening. She arrived with sparkling water for Claire and wine for herself and food from the Thai place on 5th and the energy of a woman with a specific plan. They sat at the kitchen counter. Patrice moved through the apartment with the comfort of someone who'd been here hundreds of times. She stopped at the dining table where the financial documents and Gordon's folders were stacked. "Tell me that's what I think it is," Patrice said. It's exactly what you think it is, Claire said. Patrice put her hands on her hips and looked at the stack. He built a fraud, Patrice said. Structurally, yes. While you were married to him. During the marriage, using company structures. And then he tried to settle you out of it for $240,000 and a kitchen. Patrice was quiet for a moment. He was going to send you home with that ceramic chicken and less than a fraction of a percent of what he was hiding. Yes. A longer silence. I am so glad you called Gordon, Patrice said. So am I. Patrice sat down on the couch and looked at Claire with the direct, unflinching look that had been one of Claire's favorite things about her since they were 19 years old. Are you ready for what comes next? Patrice said. The Founders Gala is next Friday. I know. That's not what I asked. Claire thought about it. The annual gala, she said. Whitmore Digital's biggest event of the year. 300 people. Press, board members, major shareholders, every person who matters to that company in one room. And you want to walk into that room. I want to walk into that room, Claire said. And I want Daniel to understand in front of all of those people that the settlement was not accepted, that the forensic review is underway, that I know what I know. Patrice looked at her. You've been quiet for 8 years, she said. Yes, Claire said. I have. And you're done with that. I am completely done with that. Patrice smiled, slow and real and full of something that had been building for a long time. Good, she said. Then sit down and let me tell you what I want to do with your hair. The night of the gala was clear and cold. March, at its most decisive. No ambiguity in the air, no softness remaining. Just the clean, dark sky and the wind off the river and the city lit along the waterfront like a statement. Claire sat in the car outside the Pendleton Hotel, engine running, radio off, her hand on the door handle, 4 minutes. She sat and breathed and thought about the night the papers arrived, the kitchen floor, the lemon rolling against the cabinet. That woman felt very far away tonight. Not a different person, but a person with a different amount of information. She had done the work. She had the shape of the thing. She was not walking in blind. She thought about Frances Beverly. She'd decided on the name 2 nights ago, alone at the kitchen table, with her hands around a mug of tea. Frances for her father, Beverly for her mother. The child she was going to raise would carry both of them. She put her hand on her stomach for a moment. Then she got out of the car. The Pendleton ballroom was exactly what it always was. Navy and silver. Tall white floral arrangements. The particular orchestrated hum of 280 people performing their own importance at each other. 5 years of Whitmore Digital's public life, celebrated in the same hotel ballroom with the same catering company and the same lighting designer. She'd helped plan the first 3 of these events. The navy dress, her hair down, Patrice having done something architectural and apparently effortless with it. The small diamond earrings her mother gave her at 30. Nothing elaborate, just herself, fully, clearly herself. She felt the moment people noticed her. It moved through the room the way a current moves through water. Heads turning, a whispered exchange, the subtle social recalibration of people understanding that something unexpected was happening. Daniel's wife is here. Daniel's ex-wife. Is that Claire Whitmore? She moved through the room, unhurried. She took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. She spoke briefly to 2 people she recognized from the foundation board. She was genuine and cordial, and she did not look like a woman who was in crisis. She was looking for Daniel. She found Marcus Webb first. He saw her from across the room and went very still. She walked to him. He met her halfway, moving toward the corridor near the coat check, out of the main current of the room, but still visible from it. Claire, he said. Marcus, She kept her voice even. I found what you suggested I look for. His jaw moved. I didn't suggest. I know. You can't tell me anything. She paused. Cascadia Infrastructure, 12.4 million, 18 months, the Meridian Acquisition Clause. He looked at her. His face did something complicated. Not relief exactly, something older than relief. The expression of a man who has been carrying a weight so long, he's forgotten what his shoulders feel like without it. I'm so sorry, he said. And it didn't sound like a legal statement. It sounded like a man who had watched something happen that he hadn't stopped and had been living with that knowledge for months. How long have you known? She asked. I suspected from the beginning of Meridian. I confirmed it about 6 months ago. I went to the board. They reviewed the acquisition structure and said it was in order. He paused. I don't believe they looked carefully. Because Daniel is very skilled at making things look in order, she said. Yes. She looked at him, this man who had built something with her husband and watched it become something else. Did you know he was planning to leave me? She asked. He looked at the floor. I knew he and Vanessa had... He stopped. He told me it was over, about 8 months ago. 8 months ago, he told Marcus it was over. 4 days ago, he filed for divorce. And for at least 3 months, the calendar had said V and Bellamont and hotel. He lied to Marcus too, she thought. He just lies. It's structural for him. What are you going to do? Marcus asked. My attorney has filed for full financial disclosure and forensic review. That's already in motion regardless of tonight. She paused. And I came here to speak to Daniel. Marcus looked at her. The decision moved across his face clearly. If you need a witness, he said slowly, a co-founder with direct knowledge of the acquisition structure, someone who has documentation he declined to destroy. Gordon Hale is my attorney, she said. You should have your own attorney present at that conversation. He nodded once, deliberate, fully committed. Good luck, he said. I don't think I need it, she said. She went to find her husband. Daniel was near the stage, 2 board members beside him. Clifford Gray, a step behind. He was in his element here. The room he'd built, arranged precisely to display him at his best. Dark suit, controlled ease, the particular confidence of a man who has never truly believed anything could touch him. He saw her when she was 10 feet away. She watched his face move through several things in approximately 2 seconds. Surprise first, then calculation. Then, briefly, something that might have been fear. Then the mask settled back into place. Smooth. In control. The performance of a man who always manages the room. Claire, he said. Daniel. She smiled. Not warmly, not coldly, clearly. The smile of a woman who means exactly what she says. You look well. I wasn't aware you were coming. That was intentional, she said. The 2 board members, Thomas Alden and Patricia Foreman, were watching with the careful attention of people who understand that something significant is happening and are waiting to understand what. Clifford Gray's face was a composed mask. Can we speak privately? Daniel said. Not a question. I think we've done quite enough speaking privately, Claire said pleasantly. Claire. His voice dropped. Warning in it. I want to be clear about something, she said. Same pleasant tone. The people nearby had stopped their own conversations. The circle of silence widened around them like rings on water. I received your settlement offer. I've retained Gordon Hale, and we've initiated a full forensic financial review of the company's acquisitions. The board members exchanged a glance. This isn't the appropriate venue for... Daniel started. I'm also pregnant, she said. The silence spread further. Not the whole ballroom, just the circle. But the circle was wide enough now to include people who mattered. People who would... Remember this. People whose next calls and emails would carry what had happened here. She watched Daniel's face. The control fractured. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in films. Just a fine crack visible to someone who had spent 14 years learning to read every expression this face made. A tightening around his eyes. A barely perceptible movement of his jaw. "We need to speak privately," he said again. "Clifford Gray called me recently," Claire said, "to communicate that Mr. Whitmore prefers an expedient resolution. I want you to know that I don't prefer expediency." She paused. "I prefer accuracy, and accuracy is going to require time. Given the Cascadia structure." The name landed. She saw it. Daniel went completely still. Thomas Alden, senior board member, turned slowly to look at Daniel. "Daniel," Thomas said. The single word measured and precise as a blade. Daniel didn't look at him. He looked at Claire. And in his eyes, with the calculation temporarily gone, she saw something she hadn't expected. Not rage, not guilt. Something closer to the expression of a man who has always assumed he was the most intelligent person in any room he entered and has just, for the first time, discovered he was wrong. "I think," Patricia Foreman said quietly, "that we need to have a conversation. Thomas, Clifford, and I. With you, Daniel." She paused. "Tonight." "Yes," Thomas agreed. Clifford Gray already had his phone out. Daniel looked at Claire one final time. She held his gaze and didn't look away. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She left the gala at 10 o'clock. She'd said what she came to say, in front of the people who needed to hear it. The rest belonged to the machinery of the law and the board and the SEC and all the institutions designed to handle exactly this kind of thing. She walked through the lobby of the Pendleton. The cold air hit her face when the doors opened. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Her hands were steady. Her heart was steady. She had expected some surge of adrenaline at the end of this, some dramatic final flood of feeling. Instead, she felt clear, stilled, and very, very tired in the clean way you're tired when you finally set something down that you've been carrying for a long time. She texted Patrice. "It's done." The response came in 10 seconds. "Tell me everything. Come over." She looked at the text for a moment. She almost went. But she thought about the baby and the quiet she needed, and she texted back, "Tomorrow. I'll tell you everything tomorrow." She got in the car. She drove home. The calls started at 11:15. Clifford Gray first. She let it go to voicemail. Then an unknown number. Let it go. Then Daniel. She looked at his name on the screen. She let it go to voicemail. She sat on the couch in the quiet apartment. Just her. The lamp on low. The ceramic chicken on the counter, visible from where she sat. She looked at the chicken. "I like that chicken," she thought. "I'm keeping the chicken." Gordon called at 7:45 in the morning. "You were efficient last night," he said, and she could hear the contained satisfaction underneath the professional tone. The board was already there, she said. It seemed practical to use the room. Thomas Alden contacted the company's outside counsel last night. An internal investigation will be initiated this week. A pause. Clifford Gray's office reached me at 6 this morning. They would like to discuss a revised settlement framework. She held the phone. "How revised?" she said. "We haven't entered that conversation yet. I wanted to speak to you first." Another pause. "I also have a message from Marcus Webb's attorney. He retained someone quickly. He retained someone last night, I believe. His attorney has communicated carefully that his client has documentation he declined to destroy and has been holding it in anticipation of an appropriate legal context. Marcus had been sitting on evidence for months, waiting for someone to create the opening. She had created the opening. And Vanessa Trent, she asked. Ms. Trent submitted her resignation from Whitmore Digital this morning, effective immediately. I have no further details about her circumstances." Claire sat with that. 29 years old, a Georgetown law degree. Whatever had happened between her and Daniel was now unraveling in ways she likely hadn't anticipated when it began. Claire didn't feel triumph about that. She didn't feel sympathy exactly either. She felt the neutrality of someone observing consequences moving through multiple lives and understanding that she was not responsible for the consequences that Daniel had set in motion. "What happens next?" she asked. "We negotiate. You are in an extremely strong position. The prenuptial agreement is almost certainly unenforceable, given the fraudulent structures built during the marriage, using what will likely be classified as marital assets. The forensic review continues. The pregnancy establishes ongoing legal obligations regardless of divorce outcome." He paused. "I expect the revised settlement discussion to look very different from the original offer." "Good," she said. "There's one additional consideration," Gordon said. "The SEC may receive a referral from the board investigation. That process is entirely separate from your proceeding. You're not a party to it, but it will affect Daniel's available assets and legal circumstances significantly." She thought about Daniel in the ballroom, the mask cracking. "That's between him and the SEC," she said. "Yes, I wanted you to understand the full landscape." "Gordon," she said, "I understand the full landscape." A brief pause. She heard the small sound of someone maintaining professional composure around something that wanted to be satisfaction. "I know you do," he said. She called her mother that morning. Beverly answered on the second ring. "I went to the gala," Claire said. "And," Beverly said, "and I said what needed to be said, in front of the people who needed to hear it. Are you all right?" "I'm—" She held the word for a moment. "Yes, I'm really okay." And she meant it in a way she hadn't been able to mean anything for a long time. "I'm genuinely okay." Beverly was quiet for a moment. "Come for dinner Sunday," she said. "I'll make that soup." "With the parsley. With the parsley." "I'll be there," Claire said. She sat on the couch after she hung up. She put her hand on her stomach. 8 weeks now. "I don't know exactly what this year looks like," she thought. "I know what I want it to look like." And for the first time in a long time, those two things are starting to move toward each other. She went to the park that afternoon, the one 3 blocks from the apartment. Old oak trees, just beginning to show the first suggestion of green at their tips. The March sky softening from its hard pale blue into something warmer. The season turning the way seasons do, gradually and then suddenly. She sat on a bench in the pale sun. She thought about what came next. She wanted to rebuild her legal practice, slowly, on her own terms. Gordon had offered. There were other options, too. She had been thinking, specifically, about the kind of work she'd done the night she found the Cascadia structure, reading financial documents for the things that were meant to stay hidden. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. She had just forgotten. She wanted to raise this child somewhere with more light. Maybe closer to her mother. Maybe somewhere new entirely. She didn't know yet. The not knowing felt different than it had a week ago. It felt less like a void and more like open ground. She sat in the pale March sun and thought, I was 40 years old and married to a man who thought I was an obstacle to move around. He spent 14 years underestimating me. That was his mistake, not mine. A woman jogged past with a ponytail swinging. 2 children chased each other between the benches. An old man walked a small dog with great dignity, the ordinary, ongoing world. She was part of it, not diminished, not erased, present. I can navigate what comes, she thought. She sat with that. She let it be real. The divorce took 9 months. That was almost poetic. 9 months of proceedings, forensic accounting, revised settlement negotiations, depositions, and the slow, methodical movement of the law through the evidence of a marriage and the crimes concealed within it. The final settlement was reached on a Thursday morning in December. She was 17 weeks pregnant, the curve of the baby visible in her profile now, deliberate and undeniable. She'd stopped trying to conceal it. It was a fact of her body and her life, and she had decided that facts were to be lived in, not managed. The terms were nothing like the original offer. Significant, Whitmore digital stock. Valued, given where the share price sat, that December, at considerably more than the original proposal had contained. The Lake House, a financial settlement that reflected the full complexity of her contribution to 14 years of marriage and to the growth of a company she'd supported from startup through public offering. Not everything she could have asked for. Courts rarely gave everything, but enough. More than enough to build something real on. The SEC investigation into the Meridian acquisition and the Cascadia structure was ongoing and separate. Not her proceeding, not her outcome to control. Marcus Webb had testified. The board investigation had produced documentation. The investigation would conclude in whatever way it concluded. What was hers was this. She had not gone quietly. She had not signed away 14 years for $240,000 and the contents of a kitchen. She had remembered what she was made of, and she had used it, and the law had confirmed what she already knew. She went back to work in January. Not to affirm. She'd considered Gordon's offer seriously, and she appreciated it genuinely. She did part-time consulting through his office for the first year, but what she was actually building, slowly and deliberately in the hours between the pregnancy appointments and the financial planning and the re-establishment of herself, was her own practice. Small by design, focused on corporate contract review and acquisition structure analysis, focused specifically on the kind of work that found the things built to stay hidden. She was very good at it. She had always been very good at it. She had just spent 8 years being someone else's wife instead. The baby was born in early June, a girl, Frances Beverly Whitmore, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, a significant amount of dark hair. The expression of a person who has just arrived somewhere very interesting and is conducting a thorough assessment. Claire sat in the hospital bed in the early morning quiet, with Frances on her chest. Pale light through the blinds, the small warm weight of her daughter, the smell of her, something ancient and immediately familiar, like a frequency her body recognized. She thought, I was married to a man who thought I was an obstacle to manage. She thought, he spent 14 years underestimating me. She thought, he is going to spend the rest of his life with the consequences of that. And then Frances made a small decisive sound and opened her hands and stretched her fingers wide, and Claire looked down at those tiny open hands, and everything else fell away. Everything else fell completely and entirely away. There is something they don't tell you about the other side of something like this. They tell you about the pain. They tell you about the grief and the process of loss and the long, unsteady work of rebuilding. All of that is true. All of it was real. But the thing they don't prepare you for is the moment somewhere on the other side, not at a clear finish line, but somewhere in the middle of the life you're building, when you notice that you are happy. Not happy because the bad thing ended. Happy because the real thing began. The following April, Claire drove to her mother's house. Frances was 10 months old, strapped into her car seat, holding a wooden ring and examining it with the concentrated focus of someone who suspects it contains secrets. The April light was warm and gold, the kind of light that feels like a promise that was made and kept. She pulled into the driveway. Her mother was already on the porch, that frequency still working perfectly after 41 years. Beverly came down the steps, and Claire opened the back door and unstrapped Frances, who immediately reached for Beverly's hair and grabbed it with considerable enthusiasm. Beverly laughed. That laugh, her mother's laugh, her daughter's hands, the smell of apple cake drifting through the open front door. Claire stood in the driveway with the April sun on her face, and she thought, "This is what I built, not what was taken from me, not what I survived. What I built." She had learned in the hardest way and the truest way that the prison door had been unlocked all along. She had been her own warden for years. And when she finally stopped waiting for Daniel's permission to walk out, she discovered that everything she'd been searching for was on the other side of that door. Not a perfect life. A real one. Entirely hers. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window while it brewed. Frances was in Beverly's arms on the porch. Her mother was pointing at something in the yard, maybe a bird, maybe just the wide, available morning, and Frances was looking at whatever it was with complete and total openness. No history yet, no accumulated hurt, just the world, fresh and enormous and full of things to examine with open hands. The coffee finished. Claire poured a cup. She held it with both hands and felt the warmth spread through her palms. Outside, the spring light came through the oak trees in long, pale bars. The oak tree at the corner of the road, the one that had been there since before she was born. Still there, still standing. Patient in the way that only very old things can be patient. She was 41 years old. She was a mother. She was an attorney. She was someone she recognized, finally and fully, after years of being someone else's arrangement of a woman. She thought, "I am so glad he filed those papers." She thought, "I am so glad I did not go quietly." She thought, starting over is not a disaster. It is the thing you do when you finally know what you are building toward. She drank her coffee. She watched her daughter in her mother's arms. The morning moved around her, unhurried and warm and entirely ordinary and entirely hers. She had nowhere else to be. She had everything she needed.
There is something I want to say before we close. This story was never really about a divorce. It was never really about a billionaire losing his empire. It was about a woman who spent years making herself smaller, quieter, more convenient, more available. And the morning she finally stopped. Claire Whitmore did something that so many women in her position don't do. She didn't run. She didn't collapse. She didn't accept what was handed to her and tell herself it was enough. She sat on the kitchen floor with a lemon rolling near her foot and divorce papers in her hands. And when she got back up, she made a decision that most people never make. She decided to remember who she was, not who she had become inside someone else's story, who she actually was. Before the marriage, before the request to stop working, before the slow, careful, invisible architecture of a man who needed her dependent. She was a corporate attorney. She was brilliant. Her mentor told her so, and she had once believed it. And in 45 days, starting from the kitchen floor, she found the fraud that 14 years of expensive legal counsel had tried to keep buried. Here is what I want you to take from this story. Control does not always arrive loudly. It does not always announce itself as control. Sometimes it arrives in the language of love. I need you present. I need you available. Can you do this for me? Sometimes it arrives as a compliment that slowly becomes a cage. You are the most brilliant person I know, said so often that you stop noticing it has replaced your actual ambition. Sometimes it looks like a partnership and functions like a disappearance. And the most frightening thing about that kind of slow diminishment is this. You stop noticing the moment you became invisible to yourself, not to other people, to yourself. That is what happened to Claire. And that is what happens to more women than any of us say out loud. But here is the other thing this story is about. Skills don't disappear. 8 years away from her profession, and Claire sat down with a stack of financial documents and found, in a single night, what had been hidden for 18 months. Because knowing something real, knowing it in your bones, the way you know it after years of hard work and real practice, that does not leave you. It waits. It waits patiently inside you for the moment you need it again. Whatever you have set aside, a career, a talent, a version of yourself that got quieter over the years, it has not left you. It is waiting. And one more thing, starting over is not the same as starting from scratch. Claire did not return to the beginning. She started from the exact point she was standing, 40 years old, pregnant, angry, grieving, and in possession of everything she had ever learned. That is not starting over. That is starting from here. And starting from here with everything you know and everything you have survived. That is more powerful than any beginning you could have made at 26. This story ends with a woman standing at a kitchen window, holding a cup of coffee with both hands, watching her daughter in her mother's arms. She is not healed from everything. She is not finished with difficulty. Life does not work that way. But she is fully, recognizably, completely herself. And that, after everything, is the most radical thing she ever did. Not the confrontation at the gala, not the fraud she found, not the settlement she won. The most radical thing Claire Whitmore did was refuse to disappear. And if you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of this story, whatever it looks like, whatever shape it takes in your life, I want you to know one thing. The door has been unlocked all along. You are the only one who can walk through it, and you don't have to be ready. You just have to begin. Final closing note. This content was manually researched, developed, and edited by our team, built with intention, not automation, to bring you stories that carry real meaning, real lessons, and real respect for every woman who listens. Every word was chosen carefully. Every story was constructed to honor the complexity of real human experience. Because you deserve content that was made for you, not just made fast. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. That matters more than you know.